The deputies laughed louder when they thought no one important was listening. They didn't know the woman sitting quietly in the back, taking notes, was about to turn their entire courthouse upside down. By the time they realized who Danielle Rivers really was, it was already too late. Danielle Rivers stepped out of a plain gray sedan and into the thick, heavy heat of Maplewood County, Tennessee. The sun had baked the courthouse parking lot into a patchwork of cracked asphalt and faded white lines, and the flag hanging over the entrance drooped, unmoved by even a whisper of breeze. Danielle adjusted the sleeve of her charcoal gray suit, smoothed a wrinkle that wasn't really there, and began crossing the lot with the slow, deliberate stride of someone who had learned long ago that rushing only drew attention. She didn't want attention yet. Not from them. The Maplewood County Courthouse loomed ahead, a squat, aging building that looked like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint or a new idea in decades. Faded yellowed windows, a rusty security gate propped permanently open, brown double doors that creaked on their hinges. Inside those walls, first impressions mattered more than facts, and the men slouching against the brick facade had already made up their minds about her before she reached the bottom of the courthouse steps. Another one of the deputies muttered under his breath, pushing his sunglasses up the bridge of his nose. His buddy, a thick-necked man with a badge tilted on his belt like it weighed too much, chuckled without even bothering to look up. Danielle heard it all, every lazy insult, every snicker. She let her face stay neutral, unreadable. She had practiced this walk in 100 towns just like this one, where a black woman in a simple suit was automatically assumed to be on the wrong side of the law or the wrong side of respectability. She pulled the heavy door open herself. No one offered help. The air inside hit her like a wall, thick with the smell of stale coffee, sweat-soaked carpet, and floor polish used too many years past its prime. A box fan clattered hopelessly in the corner near the security checkpoint, doing nothing to stir the oppressive air. Behind a worn wooden desk, 2 uniformed officers lounged, half watching a fuzzy news broadcast flicker across a mounted television. Purpose of visit, one of them grunted, not even lifting his eyes to meet hers. Observation, Danielle said evenly, offering nothing more. The officer shrugged, waved her through without asking for ID or a visitor's badge. She could have been anyone. They didn't care. They had already decided she was no one worth paying attention to. Danielle moved past them without a pause, each step measured, quiet, deliberate, the low heels of her shoes making almost no sound against the scratched tile floor. The hallways were narrow and dimly lit, lined with faded bulletin boards advertising lost dogs, church bake sales, and jury duty summons curling at the edges. As Danielle walked deeper into the courthouse, the age of the building seemed to press down on her. Not just the physical decay, the moral rot. She could feel it in the sag of the ceiling tiles, the scuff marks that no one bothered to clean, the lazy way people looked through you instead of at you. Courtroom 2B was easy to find. The door hung slightly ajar, the brass plate above it dulled with age. Danielle slipped inside without drawing attention, choosing a seat in the back row where the cracked leather bench stuck slightly to her suit. She tucked her bag neatly at her feet, her posture relaxed but alert. The room wasn't full yet. A few lawyers rustled papers at the front tables, a clerk adjusted the microphone at the judge's bench, but along the side benches lounged the same deputies who had laughed outside, now speaking just loud enough to ensure she could hear every word. "Bet she's here for child support," one said, jerking his thumb in her direction. Another snorted. "Or shoplifting. Either way, about to see some real tears." The others laughed, loud and coarse. Danielle kept her gaze on the faded wood of the bench in front of her, her face a mask of polite disinterest. She didn't blink, didn't twitch, didn't show the smallest crack they could wedge themselves into. Inside, she was writing every word down on a page only she could see. They kept going. One heavy-set deputy leaned back in his seat, popping gum loudly. "She'll pull the race card before her hearing's up. Watch." Another elbowed his friend and said with a smirk, "Probably got 4 baby daddies and a GoFundMe waiting outside." The laughter was sharper now, meaner. Danielle remained still, breathing through it, not because she didn't feel the sting, they wanted her to feel it, but because she knew they didn't deserve her anger yet. That moment would come. She pulled out a small, plain notepad from her bag and wrote one sentence. They don't even hide it. Then she tucked it away again, her movements slow, unhurried. They didn't even notice. They were too sure of themselves. They always were, in places like this. The sunlight through the grimy windows cast long shadows across the floor, broken and jagged. The fan rattled uselessly. The air grew hotter, heavier, not because of the weather but because of the arrogance that filled the room like smoke. Danielle sat a little straighter, her hands resting lightly on her lap, the epitome of invisible strength. The courtroom door swung open with a squeal of old hinges, and a voice called out, "All rise." The deputies slouched up reluctantly, barely straightening their posture as Judge Walter Reeves, a heavy-set man with a booming voice and an impatient scowl, entered the room. He settled behind the bench, flipping through a sheaf of papers without looking up. "We've got an important matter today," he said gruffly, peering over his glasses. The deputies barely pretended to pay attention, assuming it was another minor case, another forgettable docket. Judge Reeves continued, "Before we begin, I'd like to introduce a visitor. Director Danielle Rivers of the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division." The silence that fell was instantaneous, almost violent in its suddenness. Laughter evaporated. Smirks disappeared like smoke sucked out of a window. Every eye snapped toward the woman in the back row, the woman they had just spent 20 minutes mocking. Danielle rose to her feet, slow and unbothered, meeting their stunned gazes head-on with a calm that filled the room like a rising tide. She didn't smile. She didn't smirk. She didn't need to. The heavy-set deputy's mouth actually fell open, his jaw slack. The young deputy who had joked about child support turned pale, shifting his weight like he suddenly found the bench too hot to sit on. Danielle stood with the quiet dignity of someone who didn't need to shout to be heard. Her very presence was the rebuke. Her silence was the judgment. And they felt it. Every single one of them. Judge Reeves cleared his throat, awkward now, suddenly hyper-aware of the shift in atmosphere. "Director Rivers is here today for an unannounced federal observation and evaluation of courthouse procedures," he said, his voice lower now, more careful. "Given the seriousness of certain complaints, she will be observing all proceedings today." The weight of it hit like a hammer blow. The deputies shifted uncomfortably in their seats, no longer lounging, no longer smirking. Danielle took her seat again with the same composed grace, folding her hands lightly in her lap, her expression unreadable. The hearing proceeded on paper, but in truth, nothing was the same. The courthouse had forgotten how to breathe. Every whisper, every cough, every creak of a chair seemed magnified 100 times. The deputies sat like children waiting for the principal to call them out, sneaking glances toward Danielle, hoping she hadn't heard everything they had said. She had. Every word. Every sneer. Every cruel, lazy joke. But Danielle Rivers hadn't come to argue with them. She hadn't come to raise her voice or throw accusations across a courtroom. She had come to watch, to listen, and to remember. The reckoning wasn't tomorrow. It was already happening. And none of them were ready for what came next. The silence that had gripped the room after Judge Reeves's announcement didn't loosen its hold. Even as the first hearing stumbled forward, with defense attorneys fumbling through motions and prosecutors reading charges in monotone voices, the air inside the Maplewood County Courthouse stayed thick and brittle, like a pane of glass stretched too tight and waiting to shatter. Danielle Rivers sat in her back row seat, a small notepad resting lightly on her lap, her pen poised but unmoving for the moment. She didn't need to write yet. The real story was written across the faces around her, the stiffened deputies who stole quick, nervous glances toward her every few minutes, the courthouse clerks whose voices trembled ever so slightly when they addressed the judge, even Judge Reeves himself, clearing his throat more often than necessary as he shuffled papers that no longer held his full attention. Danielle had seen it before, this exact unraveling, in other towns, other courthouses, places where respect had long ago been traded for power and laziness disguised as tradition. But there was something particularly raw about Maplewood, something especially brazen in how openly they had mocked her when they thought she was nobody, and how quickly they folded now that they knew better. She watched everything, the way one deputy tapped his foot in a restless rhythm against the floor, the way another clutched his pen so tightly it snapped in half, the way conversations that used to float easily now collapsed into awkward silences the moment she turned her head. When the judge called for a mid-morning recess, the entire room exhaled at once like prisoners hearing the jangle of keys, and the courthouse emptied into the hallways in a rush of stiff backs and muttered excuses. Danielle stayed seated for a moment, giving them space to scatter, before rising smoothly to her feet and making her way toward the side exit. She didn't need to follow them to know what was happening. Deputies, huddling together in corners, whispering frantic, half-formed sentences, trying to rewrite the past 20 minutes into something less damning. She heard everything. "Man," one voice hissed from the hallway just beyond the courtroom door. "She was right there, and you were running your mouth like it was open mic night." "I didn't say anything that bad," another voice muttered defensively, too loud, the guilt bleeding through. Danielle passed by them without a glance, her heels clicking softly on the worn linoleum floor, each step a quiet metronome counting down to the moment they would truly understand how badly they had miscalculated. She didn't head for the cafeteria or the parking lot. She found a quiet alcove near the side stairwell and stood silently, watching as a team of plainclothes federal agents, all wearing discreet badges and sharp eyes, slipped into the building through the side entrance. No sirens, no flashing lights, no drawn weapons. Just quiet, deliberate purpose. The way real change always entered, unannounced and unstoppable. Agent Samuel Knox, tall and square-shouldered, caught Danielle's eye and gave a brief nod. She returned it with the slightest tilt of her head. The time for quiet watching was over. The time for reckoning had begun. One by one, the agents approached the lounging deputies who had, just an hour earlier, believed they ruled this courthouse like a private clubhouse. There were no dramatic arrests, no shouting matches. Just names read off in calm, measured tones and the quiet, soul-deep shock that followed. "Deputy Brent Holloway," Agent Knox said evenly, reading from a list. A wiry man with thinning blonde hair and a swaggering walk straightened up, trying to conjure a confidence he no longer owned. "Yeah, that's me," he said, voice cracking slightly. "You're suspended, pending federal investigation," Knox replied without raising his voice. "Badge and service weapon, now." The words hit harder than any shove or scream. Holloway fumbled at his belt, his fingers clumsy as he unclipped his badge and set it down on the table beside him with a small, metallic clink that seemed to echo off the courthouse walls. His holster followed, slower, as if the delay could somehow change the outcome. Danielle didn't move. She didn't need to. She stood at a distance, arms loosely folded, her presence a silent, unwavering reminder of why this was happening. The other deputies watched with wide, desperate eyes as more names were called. Deputy Carl Whitmore. A heavy-set man with a beer gut and an angry flush on his cheeks stomped forward, trying for defiance but managing only pitiful bravado. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath as he handed over his badge. "Just a few jokes." Danielle's gaze flicked toward him, steady and unimpressed. "Not jokes. Patterns. Arrogance. Entitlement worn like a badge of honor." She saw it all. She had seen it before. She had built entire cases out of men exactly like him, and today would be no different. The courthouse hallways buzzed with nervous energy. Lawyers whispered behind file folders. Clerks clutched their phones, pretending to text but really recording the spectacle unfolding around them. Even Judge Reeves peered out of his chambers, his face pale and tight. Danielle turned and walked slowly back toward the courtroom, giving the deputies space to dig their own graves without her needing to lift a finger. As she passed by a cluster of courthouse employees near the vending machines, she caught a few whispered words, "Maybe they'll finally clean house now, about damn time," and tucked the sentiment away like a folded note in her pocket. It wasn't anger that fueled her. It was a quiet, heavy justice. The kind that moved slow but crushed anything in its path once it arrived. Back inside the courtroom, the few remaining deputies sat stiffly in their seats, their bodies rigid with tension, their eyes flicking up toward her with something that wasn't quite fear but wasn't far from it either. Danielle resumed her seat at the back without ceremony, flipping open her notepad and writing down observations, not about the cases being heard, which blurred together in a drone of legal jargon and procedural motions, but about the men who had thought themselves untouchable. She noted every twitch, every sudden cough, every glance down at the floor. Some of them shifted constantly, unable to sit still under the weight of her gaze. Others tried to act casual, flipping through paperwork or pretending to doodle notes, but the way their hands trembled betrayed them. They had spent years perfecting cruelty in the shadows, but they had no defense against sunlight. At the front of the courtroom, Judge Reeves stumbled through the docket, his booming voice unusually hesitant. The cases dragged by: a property dispute between neighbors, a misdemeanor shoplifting charge, a probation hearing, but nobody was really paying attention. All eyes kept drifting back to Danielle, to the agents positioned quietly at the edges of the room, to the growing certainty that nothing about their courthouse would ever feel normal again. And that was the point. Danielle wasn't just there to watch proceedings. She was there to watch character. She was there to watch what people did when they thought no one important was listening, and then to make sure the consequences arrived, steady and undeniable. After another hour, the judge banged his gavel with unnecessary force and announced another recess. This time, the deputies didn't rush to the hallways. They sat frozen in place, waiting for their names to be called next, for the quiet, professional voice that would strip them of the authority they had abused so freely. Danielle stayed seated too, crossing one leg neatly over the other, her pen resting lightly against her notebook. She didn't need to say a word. Every second of silence spoke louder than anything she could have shouted. Respect is not optional. Misconduct has a price. And the bill was coming due. Slowly, inexorably, the weight of it settled over the courthouse like the thick Tennessee heat pressing against the dusty windows. Danielle watched and waited, a patient hand on the wheel, steering Maplewood County into the eye of the storm they had built for themselves, one cruel joke, one lazy insult, one act of unchecked arrogance at a time. The day wasn't over. The reckoning had only just begun. The courthouse remained eerily quiet after the second recess ended, and Danielle Rivers sat calmly at the back of the room, her notepad resting loosely in her hand, watching as the once proud deputies filed out one by one, stripped of their badges and illusions of invincibility. There was no more laughter now, no casual swagger, only the hollow shuffle of boots across cracked linoleum floors and the heavy, sinking knowledge that things had changed in Maplewood County, and there would be no slipping back to the way things were. Danielle knew that stripping a few badges wasn't enough, not here, not anywhere real rot ran deep, tangled into habits and traditions too stubborn to be pulled up by the roots in a single day. But the first crack had been made, and now it was time to drive it deeper until the whole rotten structure either healed or collapsed under its own weight. Over the next several weeks, the courthouse that had once been a fortress of unchecked arrogance became a place of wary, fragile accountability. Danielle stayed, not as a looming enforcer but as a quiet, steady presence, setting up a small field office 2 blocks away in a plain brick building with no signs and no fanfare. She didn't need to announce herself. The people who needed her already knew where to find her. They came slowly at first, trickling through the door in ones and twos, shoulders hunched, eyes darting nervously around the room like they were afraid someone would see them talking to her. But once they sat down and started speaking, the dam broke, and the truth came spilling out. A young black man, barely 20, told her how he had been pulled over 7 times in 6 months for nothing more than driving home after his night shift at the paper mill, each stop ending with a ticket he couldn't afford or a warning delivered with a smirk. A middle-aged woman recounted how her teenage son had been arrested for loitering outside his own high school while white students hung around in groups, without a second glance from passing deputies. An elderly man, his hands shaking with age and anger, described how he was ticketed and fined after calling the sheriff's office to report harassment from his neighbor because he dared to speak up at all. Story after story, name after name, the same patterns unfolded, patterns of contempt, dismissal, humiliation papered over by years of silence and fear. Danielle listened to each one with the patience of someone who understood that real justice wasn't about sound bites or headlines but about standing still long enough for the truth to take root. She didn't rush them, didn't correct them, didn't tell them what they should feel. She just listened and wrote and nodded, giving them the dignity of being heard for the first time in far too long. Meanwhile, the federal agents worked methodically, cross-referencing complaints, pulling arrest records, mapping patterns that had never been visible from a single case but screamed unmistakably when you laid them side by side. Some deputies cracked early, folding in interrogation rooms with sweaty palms and trembling voices, offering excuses as brittle and transparent as spun sugar. It was just how things were, they said. We didn't mean anything by it, they pleaded. Danielle listened to those two, not with sympathy, but with the cold, clinical precision of someone who knew that good intentions never erased harm. You chose, she said quietly, over and over, when they tried to shift blame upward or outward. Every time, you chose. And for once, there was no laughing it off, no slapping each other on the back and walking away. The courthouse itself began to change in ways small and large. New deputies were brought in, young, cautious, freshly trained, carrying themselves with a wariness that spoke less of fear and more of a hard-earned understanding that the badge on their chest wasn't a license to dominate but a responsibility to serve. Judges were sent to mandatory bias and ethics training, grumbling but attending, sitting through long, uncomfortable sessions where they couldn't hide behind robes and gavels. Court clerks underwent procedural overhauls that made it harder for favoritism and backdoor deals to slip through the cracks. Even the courthouse itself started to look different, not in the peeling paint or cracked tiles, but in the way people moved through it. Citizens no longer shuffled with their heads down, hoping not to be noticed. They stood a little straighter, spoke a little louder, began to believe, slowly and painfully, that they had the right to expect fairness when they walked through those heavy brown doors. Town hall meetings became a regular fixture instead of a rare, desperate outcry held only after some fresh injustice forced it. Danielle attended the first few, standing at the back of crowded gymnasiums and church basements, answering questions with steady patience. Not every face in the crowd welcomed her. Some were angry, red-faced men shouting about witch hunts and good men's reputations ruined. Others were wary, still too raw from years of disappointment to trust easily. But scattered throughout the anger and fear were faces lit by something else, hope, thin and fragile as smoke but growing stronger with every meeting, every question answered honestly instead of deflected or dismissed. At one forum, a teenage girl with wide, anxious eyes raised her hand and asked in a voice barely above a whisper, "How do you know it'll really change?" Danielle didn't pretend certainty. She didn't feed them easy promises. "I don't," she said simply, the room holding its breath. "But I know it won't if we pretend nothing's wrong." The girl nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding passing over her face, and Danielle felt something shift, a tiny, almost imperceptible crack in the wall of cynicism that had kept this town frozen for so long. Change wasn't a tidal wave that swept everything clean overnight. It was a slow, grueling climb, 1,000 small choices made differently day after day after day. And Maplewood County was climbing. 2 months later, Danielle returned one last time to the courthouse she had cracked open. The parking lot was still cracked, the windows still dusty, the flag still drooping in the heavy southern heat. But inside, the spirit had shifted in ways no coat of paint could replicate. The security desk was manned by a young black deputy who greeted every visitor with respectful, cautious professionalism. Courtrooms ran on time. Defendants of every race and background were called forward without smirks or muttered jokes echoing from the benches. And in the back row of Courtroom 2B, a group of high school students from the local civics class sat watching the proceedings, notebooks open, eyes sharp with the kind of restless curiosity that only comes from seeing the system not as a machine too big to challenge, but as something shaped by the choices of the people within it. Danielle watched quietly from the back, arms folded, heart steady. It wasn't perfect. It never would be. The prosecutor stumbled over a few objections. The judge showed flashes of his old impatience. But the difference was real, tangible, humming quietly in the background of every interaction, respect, not demanded, but offered freely. As the session ended and the students filed out, one boy, no more than 14, caught sight of her and paused. "You really the one who changed all this?" he asked, his voice a mixture of awe and uncertainty. Danielle smiled, small and tired but real. "I reminded them," she said. They chose. He nodded, not fully understanding yet, but something in his expression said he would remember it anyway. Maybe not tomorrow. Maybe not even next year. But someday, when it mattered most. Danielle stepped out into the late afternoon sun, her heels clicking softly on the courthouse steps. The old woman selling lemonade on the corner waved at her. A young deputy held the door open for an elderly man with a walker. Small things. But they mattered. She pulled out her notepad one last time before getting into her car and scribbled a final line across the page. Respect must be the foundation, not the exception. Then she slipped the notebook into her bag, started the engine, and pulled away from Maplewood County Courthouse, leaving behind a place that had been broken but was now, finally, trying to heal itself. The real work, she knew, was just beginning. But she also knew this much: this time, they were ready. In every town, in every courthouse, in every quiet corner where people once believed they could act without consequences, change begins the moment someone chooses to pay attention. Danielle Rivers didn't change Maplewood County with anger, or force, or grand speeches. She changed it by standing still long enough to see the truth and refusing to look away. And that's the lesson I hope stays with you today. Real change doesn't always come in a wave. It doesn't always wear a badge or carry a microphone. Sometimes, it comes quietly, in the form of a person who refuses to lower their standards, refuses to match cruelty with cruelty, refuses to let disrespect pass unchecked just because it's convenient to stay silent. The deputies in Maplewood believed they were untouchable because no one had ever held up a mirror to them before. But when someone finally did, the weight of their own choices became undeniable. Respect is not a privilege. It's not something to be handed out based on who you think someone is, what they look like, or how loudly they demand it. Respect is a foundation, one that every community, every courtroom, every badge, and every citizen should be built upon. Without it, the cracks are inevitable. To those listening today, I want to leave you with this encouragement: you don't have to hold a title like Director Rivers to make a difference. You only have to be willing to see, to listen, to speak up when it matters. Quiet strength, quiet integrity, and unwavering patience, they change more than moments. They change cultures. They change futures. And if you ever wonder whether your voice matters, whether your refusal to laugh at a cruel joke or your insistence on treating the overlooked with dignity makes any real difference, remember Maplewood. Remember that one person, paying attention, started a ripple that turned into a wave. On behalf of everyone here at U.S. Instructive Stories, thank you for taking the time to listen today. Thank you for believing, with us, that every act of decency counts, that every moment of courage matters, and that real respect, real justice, starts not with the powerful, but with each of us choosing, over and over again, to do what's right when no one is watching. If today's story moved you, inspired you, or made you think differently about the power you hold, we invite you to subscribe to U.S. Instructive Stories for more powerful true-to-life lessons like this one. Share this message with someone who believes, like you do, that real character shines brightest in the quiet moments. Until next time, stay strong, stay aware, and remember, change doesn't wait for permission. It begins with you.